Today we're talking about congruent triangles. Remember that congruent means that they have to be the same size and the same shape. Okay? And so while we're specifically focusing on triangles in this chapter, we're actually going to look at what does it take to be a congruent polygon. Okay, because a triangle is a type of polygon. So in order for two polygons to be congruent, they have to have all of their corresponding parts be congruent. Okay, so we want to know what are corresponding parts. So let's look at two triangles to start with. We're going to call these triangles ABC and HJK. Okay. And these are two identical triangles. Okay, I know that sometimes it's hard to draw them where they look identical, but they're identical. Okay. And so when we're looking at corresponding parts, we're looking at the sides and the angles of the polygon. And so remember that we can tell that AB and HJ are congruent because they each have one tick mark, and BC and JK are congruent because they each have two tick marks, and AC and HK are congruent because they each have three tick marks. Okay, so that would be the corresponding sides, right? And they may be oriented differently, meaning I could take one of these and I could rotate it to the left or the right or turn it upside down or something like that. But they would still be congruent, right? Just like in like all the Microsoft Office programs, you could copy and paste a shape and you can turn one of them a different direction, but it's still the same shape as long as you don't stretch it at all, right? Okay, and being able to name our corresponding parts is really important. It's also important that we be able to identify our corresponding angles. So you're going to notice that angle A here is between the side with one tick mark and the side with three tick marks. Okay, so this is angle A. And if we look at our other triangle, angle H is the angle made up by the side with one tick mark and the side with three tick marks. And so angle A and angle H are corresponding angles. Okay. If we're looking at angle B over here, it's made up of one side that has one tick mark and the other side has two tick marks. Okay. And if we're looking for the corresponding angle over on the second triangle, it's angle J, because again, one side is on the side with one tick mark and the other side is on the side with two tick marks. Okay. So angle B and angle J are corresponding angles. And finally, angle C is made up of one side with two tick marks and one side with three tick marks. Okay. And angle K over here, one side is the side with two tick marks and one side is the side with three tick marks. Okay, so C and K are corresponding angles. Now, it's really important that we be able to match these up, just like I've done here, because we have to be able to write a congruent statement. Okay, and so the way a congruent statement works is we name our first polygon. In this case, it's a triangle, so it gets a little triangle in front of it. Draw that better. And we just name the first one. So I would name this one triangle ABC. Okay, and then I would say, okay, triangle ABC is congruent to, and it's really important though when I go to name my second triangle that I match up each of the corresponding parts. So I've color-coded it here so you can see angle A we did in green over here, right? And angle H we did in green over here. So if angle A is first over here, its corresponding angle, angle H, has to be first on the second triangle's name. Then angle B was second over here, and so its corresponding angle, angle J, has to be second in the second triangle statement. And angle C is the third angle, and its corresponding angle, angle K, has to be the third angle over here. Okay? It's really important that it's written in this order. All right? If you had written it in a different order, for example, if you had written instead of HJK, if you had put KHJ, then it would be wrong because they are not in the same order as their corresponding angles in the first triangle. And so that's really, really important. And it's the most commonly missed thing, and it's one of those things where students, when they look back at it, they're like, oh no, I knew that I needed to do that. So Don't be one of those kids. Double check your work. If it helps you to draw out your polygon and highlight each of the angles with a different color, then do that, or use a marker or a matte pencil or a crayon or something to mark each of them, because I really think that the color coding helps. Okay, and the same rules apply whether you're dealing with a triangle or a pentagon or a hexagon or a dodecagon or something even larger. It doesn't really matter. Okay. So next we're going to talk about, you're going to hear this phrase, the congruent parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, so if we know that these two triangles are congruent, we know that each of their corresponding angles are congruent and each of their corresponding sides are congruent. And sometimes we want to be able to shrink that down and not have to write out the whole thing. Okay, so what we were saying is the congruent parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay. And so you'll notice that each of the first letters of all the big words, so of and are small words, they don't count for anything, but each of the big words has its own letter, and we just abbreviate that. And the reason we do that is so that, particularly if we were writing a proof, or if you had to justify your work somewhere, then you would be able to abbreviate it as CPCTC, and you wouldn't have to write out that whole thing because it's kind of a pain to write out. And so it's just an abbreviation to make our lives easier when we have to justify our work. Okay? So it'll only really show up if you're asked to justify your steps or if you have to work out a proof. Remember, I told you proofs aren't going away. They just slow down a little bit. Okay? Our last piece of information is called the third angles. And the third angles theorem says that if you have two angles of one triangle and they're congruent to two angles of another triangle, then their third angles have to be congruent. Okay, so let's take a look at what that looks like. So if I have two triangles here, okay, and I tell you that on, let me give them a name, sorry, just a second. And I tell you that angle A is congruent to angle D, and I tell you that angle B is congruent to angle E, then because of this rule, we know that these last two angles, angle C and angle F, have to be congruent. Okay, C has to be congruent to F. Okay, now how do I know that this is true and that it's true every time for every triangle? Well, if you remember over the last couple of days, we've been talking about that any triangle you have, all of its angles have to add up to 180. Okay, so if we say angle A over here is 50 degrees and angle B is 60 degrees, right? And I just said that these other two angles on this side have to be the same. Okay. Then I know that if I add up 50 and 60, I'm going to get 110 degrees, right? And so I would know that these two angles here add up to 110 degrees, and I know that these two angles here add up to 110 degrees. I also know, because of what we already talked about, that all of the angles on any triangle have to add up to 180. That means that my leftover angle can only equal 70 degrees. There's no other options for that. And that's going to work every time. And that's going to be true whether they give you numbers for those or if they just tell you the angles are congruent. It doesn't matter. The third angle has to be congruent if they've told you that the first two are congruent. Okay? So I will see you tomorrow in class, and I really appreciate you watching the video. Have a lovely afternoon, and see you later.